During the Armenian Genocide, hundreds of thousands of Armenians died. Now, we've mentioned the progress of the genocide several times in our regular episodes, but what we haven't talked about is the region of Armenia itself and the cultural and political background that led to the slaughter. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about the background to the Armenian Genocide. The First Republic of Armenia was formed in 1918 in the later stages of the First World War, but the historic homeland of the Armenian people had been fought over and disputed for centuries. From the 16th to 18th century, this was between the Ottomans and the Persians, and Yerevan, the capital of today's Armenia, changed hands no less than 14 times. Eventually, Greater Armenia, which was mostly Eastern Armenia, was annexed by the Persians, while Western Armenia went to the Ottoman Empire. By the 19th century, though, a new player had joined the game, the Russian Empire. Although Russia had fought Persia several times before, two Russo-Persian wars in the first few decades of the 1800s changed the situation, with Russia gaining new territory. By the 1830s, Persia had ceded most of its territory in the Caucasus and eastern Armenia to Russia. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, who were Christians, were living under the millet system, under which faith-based communities, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, had a large degree of autonomy within the empire. The Armenians were primarily in 6 provinces in eastern Anatolia, where they had their own communities and churches. A period of revolutionary awakening led to an Armenian national constitution, ratified in 1863, which provided for an Armenian General Assembly, which was granted certain powers concerning Armenian religious and cultural life within the empire. Political parties and organized resistance groups formed: Armenakan, Henchak, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. Now, the next few decades had some real flashpoints in the deterioration of relations between the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian people. For one thing, the Muslim Empire was growing smaller and weaker and was losing wars to Christian European powers and losing its territory in the Balkans to predominantly Christian emerging nations and nationalism. This provoked anti-Christian sentiment in general, but the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878 made a lot of that sentiment specifically anti-Armenian, since Armenian corps were fighting against the Turks on the Russian side in the Caucasus. In the mid-1890s, Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II, in an attempt to reassert Islam as the state ideology of his empire and strengthen its territorial integrity, called for the massacre of Armenian citizens, although the killing did end up being more anti-Christian at times, and tens of thousands of Assyrians were killed as well. The number of Armenians killed during those years, of all ages and sexes, has been variously estimated between 70,000 and 300,000. In 1909, the Young Turks came to power and did something similar. In Adana Vilayet province, pogroms against Armenians resulted in 20 to 30,000 deaths. But a few years later, an Armenian reform package was written. Now, this was the brainchild of several European powers and would create 2 big provinces from the 6 vilayets of the empire where the Armenians mostly lived, that would be under control of 2 European inspectors general, and they would oversee all Armenian-related issues. This was even signed by the Ottoman Empire in February 1914, but it went out the window later that year when the Ottoman Empire joined the war. So, the war years. The empire tried to convince Armenian leaders to provoke a rebellion of Russian Armenians against the Tsar to facilitate Ottoman conquest of Transcaucasia, right? But the Tsar promised autonomy for Russian Armenia and the 6 Armenian vilayets in the Ottoman Empire in return for loyalty and support. And he got a lot of it. I mean, Armenians were religiously and often culturally closer to Russians than Turks anyhow. But nearly 200,000 Armenians in total ended up fighting for Russia as volunteers. So the Russian Armenian Volunteer Corps, about 4 battalions strong, was formed, a military fighting unit within the Russian army, comprised mostly of Russian Armenians, but also Ottoman Armenians. Andronik Ozanian, commander of the 1st Armenian Battalion, led the Caucasus campaign. Now, he was a key figure in the Armenian National Liberation Movement, and an active member in the armed struggle against the Ottomans. and a national Armenian hero of almost legendary status. Apparently, the Kurds called him a ghost and said that bullets fell to the ground when he took off his jacket. Armenian soldiers took part in that first Russian offensive of the Caucasus campaign, the Bergman offensive, but more importantly, in the Battle of Sarikamish from late December 1914 to mid-January 1915. This battle was a spectacular disaster for the Ottoman Empire, and specifically Minister of War Enver Pasha, who screwed it up on a colossal scale. The Ottoman Third Army was nearly totally destroyed, partly by the enemy and partly by incompetence, with thousands of Turks freezing to death in summer uniforms in minus 30-degree temperatures, with some estimates claiming that as little as 10% of the Turks made it back to their base. Enver Pasha was very quick to lay blame for the defeat on the Armenians, whom he called traitors, including those that lived in Russia, not just those that defected to the Russians, and things began to explode. On April 24th, which is known as the Armenian Day of Mourning, Armenian intellectuals, politicians, and other well-known figures in Constantinople were arrested and sentenced to death. This was the official beginning of the Armenian Genocide. Soon, the order would go out to deport and exterminate Armenian civilians in villages all across Ottoman Armenia. As you may know, this was depressingly successful, despite wholesale condemnation from most of the rest of the world. There were exceptions, though. At Musa Dag, a mountain near the eastern Mediterranean coast, local citizens held out against repeated assaults for 53 days until they were rescued and evacuated by Allied warships to Egypt. 4,200 of them were saved. This inspired the internationally famous novel The 40 Days of Musa Dag. The Armenians also held out at the siege of Van until Russian relief could arrive. Van was an important cultural, social, and economic center for the Armenians, and Aram Manukyan was the community leader. He led the rebellion against the Ottomans and was joined in the siege by Andranik. The Ottomans retired to the west, and eventually the Republic of Van was established with Aram Manukyan as governor. Andranik continued his series of victories that summer with the Battle of Bitlis. This was the last Ottoman stronghold in the region and was a major Russian victory. Also at this time, the French-Armenian Agreement was signed, which called for a legion that would help with the liberation of Cilicia from the Ottoman Empire, and for this legion to one day become the Army of Armenia. However, the Russian Revolution several months later drastically changed the situation. This caused a breakdown of the Russian Caucasus campaign, and eventually the Russians and Ottomans signed the Armistice of Erzincan, which ended hostilities between them. In May 1918, Armenians proclaimed the First Republic of Armenia with Yerevan as capital. As the republic was getting going, Ottoman forces reached Alexandropol and threatened Yerevan, but after the Bolshevik Revolution, Armenia found itself without Russian support. They managed to hold off the Ottoman forces, however, though they lost a lot of territory, and that's the way things stood at the end of the war. Post-war, the republic soon fell to the Soviets and became part of the Soviet Union, and many of Armenia's leaders were forced into exile. Territorial disputes between Turkey and the Soviet Union over Armenian land were concluded without the voice of the Armenians. So there you have it. A very brief overview of the Armenians, their situation with Russia and the Ottoman Empire, and the events that led up to the Armenian Genocide. I think it's very important to note that when people write about the genocide, one often gets the impression that the Armenians were just unfortunate sheep, just meekly submitting to their fate, but the reality is anything but that. They were, and are, a strong people with deep religious and cultural traditions who certainly weren't afraid to try to assert their independence. And the Armenian Genocide remains one of the great catastrophes of the 20th century. We'd like to thank Dikram, William, and Vardan for helping us out with the research for this episode. Now, if you'd like to find out more, the Battle of Sarikamish itself, once again, a complete disaster for the Ottomans, you can click right here for that episode. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.